Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to today's story. Mark Davis had always been a man of few words, focused only on his future, or more accurately, his lack of one. At 23, he found himself juggling the final year of law school, a part-time job, and the immense weight of his late father's debts. Every day felt like a new struggle to stay afloat. His dreams of a bright future seemed to be slipping away, as bills piled up and the pressure of providing for his mother and sister weighed heavily on him. He had no time for distractions or luxuries. A modest life, a worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder, and an endless list of to-dos that was Mark's reality. It was a cold, rainy afternoon when his phone buzzed with an unexpected call. He answered it without much hope, assuming it was just another reminder of his overdue bills. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you regarding your financial situation," a calm, authoritative voice said on the other end. Mark froze for a moment. He didn't know anyone named Eleanor Brooks. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Before he could ask any questions, she cut him off. "I know about your debts. I know you're barely hanging on. I'm offering you a solution. Let's meet at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. tonight. It's important." And then, the call ended. Mark stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, unsure of what to make of it. The rain was pouring outside, as if reflecting his mood. He quickly hung up, tossed his phone into his backpack, and, despite his skepticism, made his way to the restaurant. What choice did he have? He needed money, he needed options, and here was someone offering a solution, no matter how strange it sounded. Brooks Bistro was warm and elegant, a stark contrast to the damp, cold streets Mark had just walked through. As he stepped inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and soft jazz music filled the air, making him feel out of place. He was drenched, his clothes sticking to his skin, while the patrons around him were dressed in suits and evening gowns, sipping on expensive wine. He quickly scanned the room and found the woman who had called him. Eleanor Brooks was sitting at a corner table, looking every bit the wealthy businesswoman he imagined she would be. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her tailored suit radiated power and confidence. "Mr. Davis," she greeted, gesturing for him to sit. Her voice was calm and steady, and her sharp blue eyes assessed him with a knowing look. Mark hesitated, then took the seat across from her, wiping the rain from his face and trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. "You're probably wondering why I asked to meet you," Eleanor began. "Let me be direct. I know about your financial struggles, your debts, and your situation at home. I'm here to offer you a solution to all your problems." Mark blinked, not sure if he should be intrigued or offended. "I need you to marry me," she said simply. Mark stared at her, stunned. "Excuse me," he finally managed to say, sure that he had misheard her. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. I will pay off your debts, secure your family's future, and in return, you'll be my husband. Think of it as a contract. No feelings involved, just a formal partnership." Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. It sounded insane, but the desperation inside him pushed aside any skepticism. He needed money desperately. This could be his only way out. But he wasn't sure if he should accept such an unconventional offer, especially from a woman he had just met. "Why me?" Mark asked, his voice quiet, almost incredulous. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "You're young, unattached, and in a position where you'll consider anything to survive. You're the perfect candidate for this arrangement. I don't need love, Mark. I need someone to share my name, my estate, and nothing more." The idea hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of what she was offering. A cold, calculated deal. His mind raced as he considered the offer. Was he willing to sacrifice his pride, his dignity, for financial security? Could he live a life bound by a contract that promised no emotional ties? Eleanor sat back, her expression calm, as though she knew the choice he was about to make. Take your time. Think it over. But don't take too long. The offer doesn't stand forever. Mark stared at her, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Could he turn his back on his family's financial struggles? Could he really go through with this? He took a deep breath, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. I'll do it. He had no other choice. As he stood to leave, Eleanor's gaze softened for the briefest moment, though her face remained as composed as ever. Good. We'll make the arrangements immediately. The deal was made, but what he didn't know was that this agreement would soon turn his world upside down, and their relationship, though born out of necessity, might just evolve into something neither of them expected. Mark returned home that night, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The rain had stopped, but the uncertainty inside him hadn't. He couldn't stop replaying his meeting with Eleanor over and over in his head. Her words were clear, almost too clear. Marry me. It's a business arrangement. He had accepted on impulse, desperate for a way out of his debts, but now that he was alone in the quiet of his small apartment, the weight of what he had just agreed to started to sink in. Was he really going to marry a woman he barely knew for money? He had no idea how to navigate this new reality, but he knew he had no other option. His mother needed the treatment she couldn't afford, and his sister was struggling to pay for school. This might be his only chance to fix everything. The next morning, Mark woke up early, unable to sleep, his mind still racing. The financial burden that had followed him for years loomed over him like a dark cloud. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. He wasn't the kind of man who did things like this. He wasn't someone who would agree to a loveless marriage, especially not for the sake of money. But then again, he wasn't the kind of man who had many options. He had been fighting his whole life to make ends meet, and now, here was a woman offering him a lifeline, though it came at a cost. As he sat at his small kitchen table, sipping his coffee, he couldn't help but think about what this would mean for his future. A marriage with Eleanor wasn't something he had ever imagined. She was everything he wasn't: elegant, confident, powerful. The life she led seemed like a world apart from his own. He had no idea what she saw in him, a law student barely scraping by. But there was something about her, something that drew him in despite the strangeness of the situation. Her poise, her calm demeanor, the way she seemed to have everything under control. Maybe it was that control he needed in his life right now. Later that day, Mark went to the restaurant where Eleanor had asked him to meet again. He still wasn't sure what he was walking into. He hadn't expected her to take the offer so seriously. He had hoped she would change her mind, but when he arrived at Brooks Bistro, Eleanor was already waiting for him. Her presence filled the room. She was as calm and composed as ever, her blue eyes scanning the menu in front of her. Mr. Davis, she greeted him, her voice as smooth as before, though there was a certain coldness to it now, as if she were already mentally preparing for the next steps of their arrangement. She gestured for him to sit, and he did, feeling more out of place than ever. I trust you've thought about our conversation last night? Eleanor asked, her gaze unwavering. Mark nodded, swallowing hard. I have, he said, his voice tight. I've thought about it a lot, actually. I didn't expect things to move this quickly. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. You wanted a solution to your problems, Mark. This is the solution. It's simple. I'll take care of everything: your debts, your family. All you need to do is marry me. Mark felt the weight of her words, as if they were more than just a proposition. They were a challenge, a reminder that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the people who depended on him, and he couldn't afford to fail them. She pushed a file across the table toward him. It contained the contract, the details of their arrangement, the promises they were about to make to each other. It looked so official, so final. Mark glanced at it but didn't touch it. The ink on the paper seemed to represent a different life, one that was far removed from the one he had been living. But could he really back out now? Could he walk away from an offer that could change everything for his family? "I'm not asking for love," Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "This isn't about affection. It's a partnership. You'll get what you need, and I'll get what I need. Simple. You've seen the terms, you know what's required." Mark stared at the contract. His eyes wandered over the words, but his mind kept returning to one question: what would it mean for him to actually sign this? To bind himself to this woman, to this arrangement? Was he ready to give up his chance at love, at a real relationship, for a life of security and comfort? His heart pounded in his chest. He could feel his pulse in his ears, the pressure of the moment building with every passing second. This was the point of no return. But then, as he looked up at Eleanor, something shifted inside him. He wasn't just signing a contract. He was changing the course of his life. He didn't know if it was the right decision, but it felt like the only decision. He reached out and took the pen from her hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he signed his name at the bottom of the page. A deal was made, but what neither of them realized was that this agreement would lead them down a path neither had expected. The air between them felt different now, thicker with unspoken tension, as if the contract was not just a formal agreement, but a gateway to something neither of them were prepared for. Eleanor looked at him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened just the slightest bit. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice carrying a tone that hinted at something deeper, something more than just business. Mark didn't know it yet, but his world was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The life he thought he was signing up for was just the beginning of something far more complicated and emotional than he could have ever expected. The days following Mark's decision were a blur. The contract had been signed, and his life had been irrevocably altered. Mark couldn't shake the weight of the decision he had made. Every morning, as he looked at himself in the mirror, he reminded himself why he had agreed to marry Eleanor. It was for his family, for the security they needed. His mother's treatments, his sister's tuition, the debts that had been hanging over him for years, these were the reasons. But every time he thought about the upcoming marriage, something inside him twisted with doubt. Was it really just a business deal, as Eleanor claimed, or was there more to this arrangement than he was willing to admit? He had seen Eleanor only a few times since that fateful meeting. Their communication had been minimal, with her team handling most of the details of their upcoming wedding. She had been kind but distant, always keeping things professional. There had been no hint of affection, no indication that she was anything but the businesswoman she had presented herself to be. Mark had told himself over and over that this was for the best, that he could handle the lack of emotional connection. But as the day of the wedding approached, he couldn't ignore the growing unease in his chest. The evening before the wedding, Eleanor invited him to her penthouse to finalize the details. Mark arrived at the towering building, his mind still reeling. As he stepped into the elevator, his heart pounded. The sleek, modern interior of the building felt worlds apart from his small apartment, and he couldn't help but feel out of place. When the elevator doors opened, he was greeted by Eleanor's assistant, who led him down a long corridor to her door. Eleanor was waiting for him inside, dressed casually but still exuding elegance. She greeted him with a polite smile and gestured for him to sit. The room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city below. Everything about her life seemed perfect, beautiful, polished, and controlled. And yet, Mark couldn't help but feel that he was just a pawn in a much larger game. "I hope you're ready for tomorrow," Eleanor said, her voice steady but with a hint of something Mark couldn't quite place. She sat across from him, her gaze fixed on him. "Everything has been arranged. The ceremony will be simple, private, just the two of us. No big fuss. Just the way I prefer it." Mark nodded, though his throat felt tight. "I'm ready," he said, even though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was ready for anything. He wasn't sure if he would ever be ready for this life he had signed up for. Eleanor studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. "You don't have to worry, Mark. This isn't about love. It's a practical arrangement. You'll have everything you need. This is just business. She paused, her expression softening slightly. But that doesn't mean it has to be cold. We can make it work, if we choose to. Mark's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, there was something different in her eyes, something warmer than the businesslike demeanor she had always shown. It was a fleeting moment, a crack in the carefully constructed wall she had built around herself. But it made him wonder, was she really as cold as she seemed, or was there something more to her that he hadn't seen yet? Before he could respond, Eleanor stood and walked over to the window, her back to him. I've built this life on control, Mark. I don't let emotions get in the way of business. But I can't deny that I've thought about what this arrangement means for both of us. And I'm willing to try if you are. Her words hung in the air between them. Mark didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the emotional complexity that came with this arrangement, but he knew one thing: this marriage, for better or for worse, was going to change both of their lives. I'll try, Mark said quietly, standing up to join her at the window. But we need to be clear about one thing: this isn't going to be easy for either of us. We're not starting with a clean slate. We're starting with a contract. But maybe, just maybe, we can make it work. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes searching his. There was a moment of silence, before she nodded. We'll see. But I'm willing to give this a chance, Mark. We both deserve that. As the evening wore on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change in ways he couldn't predict. What had started as a simple business deal was slowly evolving into something far more complex, far more personal than either of them had anticipated. And though he still wasn't sure what the future held, he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. The next morning, Mark stood in front of the mirror once more, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Today was the day. The day he would marry Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, for reasons that seemed both clear and unclear at the same time. He could hear the faint sound of the city outside, the hum of life going on as usual. But for him, everything was about to change. The morning of the wedding arrived, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie, his reflection staring back at him with a look of uncertainty. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He had made this decision, a choice he never imagined making, and now he was standing on the edge of something that would change everything. His thoughts drifted back to the night before, to Eleanor's words. This isn't about love. It's a business arrangement, she had said. But something in her voice, something in her eyes when she had spoken about trying, made him wonder if there was more to this than just business. Was there a chance for something real between them, or was he walking into a life of pure transactional coldness? The clock ticked on, and soon it was time. Mark stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, his mind still spinning. There was no turning back now. He had promised Eleanor that he would go through with this, and he would. But the nagging doubt in the back of his mind refused to go away. Could he really go through with this without feeling something? Would he ever feel anything other than the weight of obligation? At the grand venue, Eleanor's penthouse had been transformed into an elegant space for their small, private ceremony. The place was beautiful, of course everything about Eleanor's world seemed perfect, from the polished floors to the soft glow of the chandeliers. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged in a fairy tale, but the fairy tale was not about love, it was about business. Mark couldn't help but feel out of place in such luxury. This wasn't his world, and it never would be. Eleanor arrived shortly after, dressed in a simple, yet elegant, white dress. She looked stunning, her silver hair framing her face perfectly, but there was no trace of emotion in her eyes. She was all business, just like she had been from the very beginning. Mark's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly pushed aside the feeling. This was not the time to dwell on emotions. They had made their decision, and now they had to follow through. When they stood together at the altar, Mark couldn't help but notice how distant Eleanor seemed, her face set in a mask of calm, unwavering composure. She wasn't nervous or excited, she was just going through the motions. And so was he. It was as if they were two strangers fulfilling a contract, nothing more, nothing less. The officiant spoke, words Mark couldn't fully comprehend. His thoughts were clouded, his focus broken by the strangeness of the situation. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor's voice was steady, clear. Her words were brief but firm, exactly what he had expected. I, Eleanor Brooks, take you, Mark Davis, as my husband, not for love, but for mutual benefit and respect. Mark repeated his vows, his voice tight, his mind racing. What had he just agreed to? This wasn't a marriage, it was a deal. But as he looked at Eleanor, standing before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was brewing beneath the surface. The ceremony ended with a soft kiss, a formality, nothing more. There was no passion, no love, just the cool, hard reality of what they had agreed to. Mark felt a pang of disappointment, but he quickly suppressed it. This was not supposed to be about love. This was a business arrangement. He had made his choice. He had to live with it. As the guests began to leave, Eleanor took his arm, leading him into a private room. The weight of the day seemed to settle over both of them. She smiled softly, but there was still something unreadable in her eyes. Thank you for doing this, Mark, she said quietly. I know this isn't easy, but I believe it will work out. We just need to give it time. Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. He had gone through with it, had made the commitment, signed the contract, but now that it was real, he wasn't sure where he stood. Was this really going to work? Could a marriage born out of necessity ever turn into something more? He glanced at Eleanor, her calm exterior hiding any trace of doubt or fear, and for the first time, he wondered if maybe she, too, was questioning the decision. But there was no time to dwell on it. This was their life now. A life of rules, boundaries, and mutual respect. Love, if it ever came, was something that would have to wait. Later that evening, as Mark sat alone in his new suite, the weight of the day finally hit him. The room was quiet, the soft hum of the city outside the only sound that filled the space. He looked out the window, his reflection in the glass matching the emptiness he felt inside. This was the life he had chosen, but as he stared out at the city below, he couldn't help but wonder, could he ever find happiness in a life built on such a cold, practical foundation? As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor fell into a strange routine, one that was both familiar and foreign. They spent their days in separate offices, handling their individual responsibilities, only coming together for meetings, events, or the occasional dinner. It was business as usual, but the more time Mark spent with Eleanor, the more he began to wonder if there was something more to their connection. As the weeks went by, Mark found himself settling into the strange rhythm of his new life. He had kept his distance from Eleanor, respecting the boundaries they had agreed upon. The agreement was clear: no emotional attachment, just a formal partnership. He spent most of his time at the law firm, and Eleanor focused on her business, always with the same cool demeanor that had first drawn him to her. They rarely saw each other outside of meetings, and when they did, their interactions were brief and professional. But something was changing, something that Mark couldn't ignore. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Mark found himself in the living room of their shared penthouse. The place still felt foreign to him, despite living there for weeks. It was pristine, elegant, and clearly designed to impress. Yet, it felt empty. There was no warmth, no personal touch. He had expected that, of course. Eleanor was a woman of control, and control meant keeping everything in its place. But as he sat alone in the silence, something inside him shifted. He thought about the wedding day again, about the vow he had taken, and the way Eleanor had looked at him when they exchanged those words. It wasn't love, not in the traditional sense, but there had been something there. Something real, buried deep under the surface. It wasn't long before Eleanor returned home that evening, a little earlier than usual. She walked in, her heels clicking against the floor, her coat still draped over her shoulders. She was tired, that much was obvious, but there was a certain energy about her tonight, something different. Mark looked up from his spot on the couch and watched her carefully. She caught his gaze and for a moment there was a brief silence between them, as if both were waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Eleanor set her bag down and walked over to where Mark was sitting. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, though still measured. "It was fine," Mark replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "Busy, you know. The usual." He paused for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He had never been good at small talk, especially not with her. "How about you?" Eleanor shrugged slightly, her posture a little more relaxed than usual. "Same. Lots of meetings, lots of decisions to make. You know how it is." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "It's been a while since we actually talked, hasn't it?" Mark nodded, his eyes now meeting hers. He hadn't realized it until she mentioned it, but it was true. They had spent the past few weeks keeping their distance, following the script they had set for themselves. They hadn't really talked about anything other than business, hadn't had a real conversation about life, about who they were. They had both been so focused on keeping everything professional that they had forgotten to connect. "I guess it has," Mark said quietly. "It feels like we're just going through the motions." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that surprised him. "Is that what you think? That we're just going through the motions?" He wasn't sure how to respond. "Well, yeah, I mean, we're married, but it's all just a contract, isn't it? A deal. That's what we agreed to." For the first time in weeks, Eleanor's expression softened, just a little. She walked over and sat beside him on the couch, her posture still poised but somehow less distant. "I didn't expect this to be easy, Mark," she said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't expect us to suddenly fall in love or anything. But I do think we're starting to build something here. Something that could be real, if we let it." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting her to push back, to insist that everything was just as it had been agreed upon. But this was different. This was the first time she had said something that made him wonder if she felt something more than just a business arrangement. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that this isn't affecting me. I didn't sign up for this. I signed up for security, I signed up to help my family. But I didn't expect to feel," he paused, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't expect to feel like this. Like I'm living in some kind of strange limbo." Eleanor was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the words he had just spoken. Then she finally spoke, her voice quiet but sincere. "You don't have to pretend anymore, Mark. I never wanted you to. I never wanted you to feel like you had to bury your feelings. This isn't easy for me either. I didn't expect to be in a situation where I might actually want something more than just a business arrangement." She paused, her gaze shifting away for a moment, before she turned back to face him. "I didn't expect you to be someone I could rely on, someone I could," she trailed off, as if unsure of how to finish her sentence. Mark felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He didn't know what this was between them, but he knew one thing: things were changing. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. There was something more between them now, something they had both been trying to ignore. But could they allow it to grow, or was it too late? Before he could say anything, Eleanor stood up and walked toward the window, her back to him. "Maybe we don't have to figure everything out right now. But we can try, Mark. We can give it a chance." He watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, we can try." As the evening went on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the life he had signed up for was no longer the life he was living. The boundaries they had set were slowly crumbling, and he wasn't sure what that meant for their future. But one thing was clear: wasn't ready to let go just yet. The following days felt like a slow unraveling, the life Mark had once known fading into the background as new, unfamiliar feelings began to take their place. He had agreed to the arrangement, signed the contract, and married Eleanor with the promise of security, of helping his family. But now, after the quiet conversation they had shared in the living room, something had shifted between them. There was an unspoken understanding growing, a bond neither of them had anticipated. Mark spent the next few days in a haze, trying to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to Eleanor. She had been distant at times, but when they spoke, there was an honesty in her voice that had caught him off guard. The idea that they could be something more than just a business partnership was starting to settle in his mind, though he wasn't sure what to do with it. He was confused, conflicted. He had spent his life fighting for his family's survival, never once thinking that he could find something more, something real in the process. And now that it was starting to happen, he was unsure how to handle it. One evening, Eleanor suggested they attend a charity gala together. It was an event she often hosted for one of her many philanthropic causes, and while Mark had no interest in the glamour of it all, he agreed. He was beginning to understand that being part of her world meant playing along with the roles she had created for herself. Besides, there was no denying that the galas, the mingling, the charity work it all seemed to be an essential part of her life. It wasn't just business, it was her life's passion. When the night arrived, Mark found himself dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, feeling like a stranger in the mirror. He looked at himself, unsure of what he was supposed to be, who he was supposed to be. Was he just the husband of a powerful woman, or was there something more to his role in this world? He sighed, straightened his tie, and made his way downstairs. Eleanor was already in the car waiting for him, looking every bit the part of a woman who was in control. She wore a sleek, midnight blue gown that highlighted her stature, her silver hair elegantly swept back. Her presence was commanding, and yet there was a hint of vulnerability in the way she held herself that night, something Mark had never noticed before. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked, her voice calm, yet there was a slight edge to it, as though she, too, was preparing herself for something that night. Mark nodded, not quite sure what to expect. "I'm ready," he replied, his voice steady, though he could feel his heart beating faster than usual. The event was held in one of the grand ballrooms of a hotel that overlooked the city's skyline. It was a lavish affair, with dozens of guests already mingling, the soft hum of conversation filling the air. Mark felt out of place, surrounded by people who looked like they belonged here. People who had power, wealth, status. He couldn't help but wonder how Eleanor had managed to carve out such a space for herself in this world. As they made their way through the crowd, Eleanor introduced Mark to various guests, all of them offering polite smiles, congratulatory comments on the wedding, and small talk that Mark could barely keep up with. He tried to keep his focus, but his mind kept drifting back to her Eleanor. She was poised, confident, and in her element. And yet, when their eyes met, there was a flicker of something deeper. A connection. He was starting to see it now, the way she looked at him when no one else was around. It wasn't just politeness anymore. It was something else, something Mark couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the quiet moments they had shared, the conversations that were becoming less about the contract and more about who they were as individuals. He was beginning to see Eleanor not as the powerful businesswoman he had first met, but as a woman who had her own struggles, her own fears, just like him. Mark was snapped out of his thoughts when he felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Eleanor, standing beside him, her smile polite but distant. "I need to speak with a few people," she said, her tone professional. "I'll be right back." Mark watched her walk away, her figure blending into the crowd of guests. It was in that moment that he realized how much he had grown to depend on her, not just for the security she offered, but for the sense of connection he had been missing for so long. This strange arrangement they had, this contract, was slowly becoming more than just a deal. It was becoming a partnership, one that Mark wasn't sure he was ready to admit he needed. As the night wore on, Mark found himself standing alone, watching Eleanor from across the room. She was laughing with someone, her eyes sparkling with something he hadn't seen before. And in that moment, he felt a twinge of jealousy, something he hadn't expected to feel at all. Was this really what he wanted? Was he falling for her? The realization hit him hard. He had been so focused on the logistics of their marriage, the reasons behind it, that he had never stopped to think about his own feelings. He had allowed himself to become numb to the possibility that this could turn into something more. Something real. But now, as he watched her interact with the people around her, he knew that he couldn't hide from his feelings any longer. Eleanor returned a few moments later, her face softening when she saw him standing there, lost in thought. She smiled at him, and this time, it wasn't the polite smile he had grown used to. It was genuine. "You okay?" she asked, her voice lower now, a touch of concern in her eyes. Mark nodded, though his heart was still racing. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said. "Just thinking." He paused for a moment before adding, "Maybe I'm starting to get the hang of this." Eleanor's smile deepened, and for the first time, Mark saw her truly let down her guard. "Good," she said softly. "We're in this together, remember?" As the night continued, Mark couldn't help but feel that things were changing between them. Slowly, but surely, he was beginning to see the woman beneath the businesswoman. And maybe, just maybe, they were both starting to see each other in a new light. It wasn't just a contract anymore. It was becoming something real. As the days passed after the gala, Mark found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions that he couldn't quite understand. Things had shifted, not just with Eleanor but within himself as well. The connection that had been growing between them, subtle and almost imperceptible at first, was now undeniable. Every time he saw her, when their eyes met across the room, or when they spoke, there was something more than just business. But there was also confusion, a hesitation. Mark had agreed to this marriage for security, for his family's future. He hadn't planned on it becoming anything more. But now, he wasn't so sure. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed more distant than ever. The conversations that had begun to feel more personal now felt stiff and forced. She had gone back to her cool, controlled self, the woman who spoke of things like profits and mergers, never letting anything too personal slip. Mark couldn't understand what had happened. The warmth between them had been so real just a few days ago. Had he imagined it? Or had she pulled back because of the same reasons he was holding back, fear of what could come from crossing that line? One evening, as they sat down for dinner, the silence between them was heavier than usual. Mark could feel the tension building. They were both avoiding the conversation that was looming over them like a storm cloud. Finally, Eleanor put down her wine glass and spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "Mark, I think we need to talk." Mark looked up, surprised by the softness in her tone. It wasn't the usual commanding voice he was used to. "About what?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew where this was going. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "About us. About this marriage. We can't keep pretending it's just a business arrangement, not anymore." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected her to say that, and yet, somehow, he felt relieved. He wasn't the only one struggling with what had begun to happen between them. "I know," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I've been feeling it too." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand him better, trying to find something in him that had been hidden before. "I never wanted this to be a fake relationship, Mark," she said softly. "I never wanted to keep things cold, even though I've tried. I don't know how to handle all of this. I don't know how to feel." Mark reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before he touched hers. It felt different now, this simple gesture. There was something real in it. He had wanted to keep his distance, to protect himself from getting hurt. But in this moment, he realized he couldn't keep pretending. "I didn't expect any of this either," he admitted. "I thought it would just be a way to get by, a way to help my family. But somewhere along the way, I started caring. And I don't know what to do with that." Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was enough to make Mark's heart skip a beat. "I'm glad you said that," she said quietly. "Because I've been wondering if I'm the only one who's been feeling like this." They sat there in silence for a few moments, their hands still touching, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The tension that had once felt suffocating between them was now replaced by something else, a fragile understanding. I don't know what comes next, Eleanor finally said, her voice still soft, but with a new determination. But I think we owe it to ourselves to find out. We're not just living in this arrangement anymore. We're living together. And that's something we need to figure out. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words sink in. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. It wasn't just about survival, about getting by. It was about something real, something they could build together if they chose to. And for the first time, Mark allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, they could have a future beyond the contract. I'm willing to try, Mark said, his voice steady now. If you are. Eleanor's eyes softened, and she gave him a small, genuine smile. Then let's try. As the evening went on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just shifted. The walls that had kept them apart, the ones built to protect their hearts, were starting to crumble. And even though he was still unsure of what the future held, for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he could hope again. For the first time, Mark understood that this was no longer about a contract. This was about them, together. The days that followed were filled with an unfamiliar but comforting sense of ease. Mark and Eleanor had begun to settle into a new rhythm, one that was no longer just about the contract. It was something deeper, something more personal. They had started talking more, really talking, not just about business or their roles in each other's lives, but about their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. For the first time since their wedding, Mark didn't feel like he was playing a part. He was beginning to see Eleanor not just as the woman he had agreed to marry out of necessity, but as someone he was genuinely getting to know and, perhaps, even care for. One evening, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for dinner at one of her favorite restaurants, a quiet, intimate place that she frequented when she wanted to escape from the high-powered world she usually inhabited. Mark had been hesitant at first, unsure if it was just another business dinner, but Eleanor had reassured him. I want this to be just us, she had said, her voice soft, almost vulnerable. No business, no contracts, just two people sharing a meal. We don't need anything else. When they arrived, the restaurant was warm and welcoming, the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses creating a soothing atmosphere. It felt so different from the grand, formal dinners they had attended together before. There were no cameras, no business partners, no expectations, just the two of them. As they sat down at their table, Mark couldn't help but notice how different Eleanor seemed in this setting. She was relaxed, her posture softer, her smile more genuine. He had never seen this side of her before, and it made him realize how much he had been missing by only seeing her as the powerful businesswoman. I'm glad we're doing this, Mark said, his voice sincere. It feels normal. In a good way. Eleanor smiled, her eyes brightening. Me too. I think we've both been so caught up in what this arrangement was supposed to be, we forgot about what we could make it. What it could become. Mark felt a warmth in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was more than just the food or the setting, it was the moment, the connection. This wasn't just a dinner. This wasn't just two people fulfilling an obligation. This was something more. Over the course of the evening, they shared stories about their childhoods, their families, the dreams they had put aside for the sake of their careers. Eleanor told Mark about the sacrifices she had made to build her empire, and Mark shared the struggles he had faced growing up, trying to balance his family's needs with his own aspirations. They laughed, they opened up, and for the first time, they weren't two people bound by a contract, they were two people simply getting to know each other. At the end of the meal, when the waiter brought over the bill, Eleanor insisted on paying, as she always did. But this time, something felt different. Mark reached out to stop her, taking the bill from her hands. No, he said, smiling. Tonight, I get to pay. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, surprised, but then a soft smile spread across her face. You're sure? Mark nodded, his gaze steady. I'm sure. As they walked out of the restaurant, the night air cool against their skin, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment, just a quiet, genuine understanding. They were no longer just playing their roles, they were becoming something more. Something real. Eleanor stopped for a moment, turning to face him. I know this hasn't been easy for either of us, she said, her voice soft but sincere. But I think we're both learning how to make this work. And I'm grateful for that. Mark looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the woman beneath the business persona. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the same uncertainty he had felt when they first met. And in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just living a life of obligation anymore. He was living a life of possibility. I'm grateful too, he said, his voice low, sincere. Maybe this is the start of something different. Something we didn't expect. Eleanor's smile widened, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to fall away. There was no business, no contract, just the two of them, standing together under the soft glow of the streetlights. And in that moment, Mark knew that whatever came next, they had both made a choice. A choice to let this be real. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they were no longer afraid to find them together. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor's connection deepened in ways neither of them had expected. Their relationship, once a business arrangement, had transformed into something far more complex and, surprisingly, fulfilling. They had started to spend more time together, sharing not only meals but their dreams, their ambitions, and the parts of themselves they had kept hidden for so long. Mark had begun to see Eleanor as more than just the powerful businesswoman who had once seemed untouchable. He saw the person behind the suit, the woman who, despite her cold exterior, had a warmth and vulnerability that matched his own. And for the first time, Mark found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had started to build something real. One afternoon, Eleanor surprised him with a visit to an art gallery. It was a place she had often talked about but never had time to visit. The gallery was small, intimate, filled with modern art pieces that spoke to the soul. Mark had never considered himself an art enthusiast, but something about the way Eleanor looked at the paintings, the passion in her eyes, made him realize how much he was starting to understand her. As they walked through the exhibit, they stopped in front of a painting, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like they were sharing something beyond words. I used to come here when I needed to clear my head, Eleanor said, her voice soft. There's something about art, something about how it makes you feel things that words can't express. Mark nodded, looking at the painting she was admiring. I get it now, he said quietly. It's like you can see a part of someone's soul in their work. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something he had never seen before, a sense of peace. The walls between them had come down, not because they had forced it, but because they had chosen to let go of the facades they had built. Later that evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Mark turned to her. The quiet was comfortable, the silence filled with a shared understanding that had grown between them. Eleanor, he began, his voice steady, I don't know when it happened, but I think I've fallen for you. Not because of the contract, not because of anything other than you. Who you are. I never expected this, but here we are. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wide for a moment before they softened. She had heard those words before, from other people, but never from someone who had truly seen her. Not the businesswoman, not the image she projected, but the person she had kept hidden from the world. She had always guarded herself, always kept her emotions in check, but Mark had changed that. I didn't expect it either, Eleanor replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I think I've been falling for you too. Slowly, without even realizing it. It's strange, but I feel like I can be myself around you, like we're building something together that's real. Mark reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held more meaning than either of them could fully express. The contract that had once defined their relationship now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the truth they had both come to accept. We're not perfect, Mark said, squeezing her hand gently. But maybe that's what makes this work. We're both just two people trying to figure it out. Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening as she leaned in closer. Maybe we don't have to have it all figured out. Maybe it's enough to just keep trying. Together. And for the first time, Mark felt truly at peace. The uncertainty that had once plagued him, the doubts that had kept him awake at night, had disappeared. He didn't need a perfect plan, or a clear path ahead. He just needed what they had now. What they had built, slowly, over time. A partnership, a connection, something real. As the night stretched on, the city below them buzzing with life, they sat together in the quiet, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. No longer bound by a contract, but by the choice they had made to let their hearts lead the way. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they were both ready to walk it together. And so, with no more walls between them, Mark and Eleanor stepped into a future filled with possibilities, where love wasn't just a contract, but a choice they had made, together.